In the shadowed halls of Blackthorn Manor, a single cup of tea hides a poison that silences a life. Who among the polished guests, each with a secret to guard, wielded the fatal dose? Was it the ambitious Philip, desperate to bury his past? The elegant Lady Beatrice, drowning in hidden debts? Or young Eleanor, torn by love and loyalty? As whispers of betrayal echo through the estate, only Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and sharper mind, can unravel the truth. But what dark secret drove a killer to strike? And will the little grey cells uncover it before another life is lost? Step into a world of deception, where every clue counts, and no one is what they seem. Chapter 1. The Quiet of St. Mary Mead. The village of St. Mary Mead lay draped in the soft hush of an October evening, its cobblestone lanes bathed in the amber glow of gas lamps. The air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves, and the chimneys of the tidy cottages puffed gentle plumes into the twilight. At the heart of the village stood Meadowview Manor, the grandest house in the parish, its ivy-clad walls looming with a quiet dignity that belied the secrets it held. Tonight, the manor was alight with anticipation, for Lady Beatrice Ashford was hosting a gathering to celebrate the engagement of her nephew, Charles Ashford, to the charming but enigmatic Miss Evelyn Warrender. Miss Jane Marple, the village's keenest observer of human nature, sat in her modest drawing-room at Danemead Cottage, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she pondered the invitation she had received. It was not her custom to attend such lavish affairs, but Lady Beatrice had insisted, and Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for the undercurrents of village life, sensed something amiss. "There is always a shadow beneath the glitter," she murmured to herself, her sharp blue eyes narrowing as she set her knitting aside and adjusted her lace shawl. At precisely 7 o'clock, Miss Marple arrived at Meadowview Manor, her neat figure clad in a sensible tweed skirt and a prim lavender blouse. The manor's oak doors swung open, revealing a grand hall adorned with portraits of Ashford ancestors, their stern gazes seeming to watch the arriving guests. Lady Beatrice, a formidable woman of 60 with silver hair swept into an elegant chignon, greeted Miss Marple with a warm but distracted smile. "Dear Miss Marple, how kind of you to come. Charles is simply radiant tonight, and Evelyn, well, she's quite the modern young woman." Miss Marple inclined her head politely, noting the faint tremor in Lady Beatrice's voice. The hall was alive with the murmur of conversation and the clink of champagne glasses. The guests were a carefully curated circle. Charles Ashford, the dashing heir to the Ashford fortune, stood beside Evelyn Warrender, whose auburn hair gleamed under the chandelier. Evelyn's smile was radiant, but her eyes darted nervously, as if seeking an escape. Nearby, Dr. Lionel Hayworth, the village physician, conversed with Mrs. Clara Pennington, a wealthy widow known for her sharp tongue and sharper investments. Major Reginald Forsyth, a retired military man with a penchant for brandy, laughed loudly at his own joke, while his wife, Margaret, hovered anxiously at his side. Lastly, there was young Timothy Blake, Charles's cousin, whose boyish charm masked a restless ambition. As Miss Marple sipped her sherry, she observed the room with her characteristic acuity. Charles and Evelyn stood close, yet their hands did not touch. Mrs. Pennington's gaze lingered on Charles with a possessive intensity, while Major Forsyth's booming voice seemed to cover a deeper unease. Timothy Blake, meanwhile, stood apart, his eyes fixed on Evelyn with an expression Miss Marple could not quite decipher. Admiration, perhaps, or something darker. The evening progressed with the usual pleasantries. A string quartet played softly, and servants glided through the crowd with trays of canapés. Yet, beneath the polished surface, Miss Marple sensed a current of tension. At 9:30, Lady Beatrice clapped her hands to announce dinner, and the guests moved toward the dining room. It was then that a piercing scream shattered the air, echoing from the upper floors of the manor. The guests froze, their faces a tableau of shock. Lady Beatrice's hand flew to her throat, and Charles's face drained of colour. "That came from the library," he said, his voice tight. Without hesitation, he bolted up the grand staircase, followed closely by Dr. Haworth and Major Forsyth. Miss Marple, moving with surprising agility for her age, followed at a discreet distance, her mind already cataloguing the details of the scene. In the library, they found Evelyn Warrender slumped in an armchair by the fireplace, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. A letter opener lay on the floor beside her, its blade glinting in the firelight. Dr. Haworth knelt beside her, his fingers seeking a pulse, but his grim expression confirmed what Miss Marple had already suspected. "She's dead," he said quietly, "stabbed through the heart." A gasp rippled through the gathering crowd. Lady Beatrice swayed, clutching the arm of a nearby chair, while Charles stared at Evelyn's lifeless form, his hands trembling. "Who could have done this?" he whispered, his voice breaking. Miss Marple's eyes swept the room, noting the open window, the scattered papers on the desk, and the faint scent of cigarette smoke lingering in the air. She stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "We must send for the police, of course," she said, "but we must also preserve everything exactly as it is. The truth, I find, often lies in the smallest details." As the guests murmured their shock and grief, Miss Marple's mind was already at work, piecing together the fragments of the evening. Evelyn Warrender's death was no accident, and the manor's closed circle of guests held the key to her murder. Somewhere in their polite smiles and guarded glances lay a deadly secret, and Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for human nature, was determined to unravel it. Chapter 2. The Crime. The library at Meadowview Manor was a scene of controlled chaos, as the reality of Evelyn Warrender's death settled over the gathered guests like a heavy fog. The room, with its towering bookshelves and heavy velvet drapes, seemed to close in around them. The fire's glow casting long shadows across the oak-panelled walls. Evelyn's body remained in the armchair, her auburn hair spilling over the cushion, her face frozen in an expression of surprise and fear. The letter opener, its silver handle gleaming, lay accusingly on the rug, a stark reminder of the violence that had shattered the evening's elegance. Miss Jane Marple stood near the fireplace, her small frame unobtrusive, yet her presence commanding. Her sharp eyes darted from the body to the room's details, the open window letting in a chill October breeze, the disarrayed papers on the mahogany desk, and the faint smudge of ash on the hearth. She noted the positions of the guests who had gathered in a loose semicircle around the scene, their faces a mixture of shock, grief, and something less definable. Guilt, perhaps, or fear. Lady Beatrice Ashford, her composure fraying, clutched a handkerchief to her lips. "This is monstrous," she whispered. "Who could do such a thing in my home?" Her voice trembled, but Miss Marple detected a note of calculation beneath the distress, as if Lady Beatrice were already considering the implications for the Ashford name. Charles Ashford stood closest to Evelyn, his hands clenched into fists. "She was so alive just moments ago," he said hoarsely, his eyes fixed on his fiancée's lifeless form. "We were to be married in the spring." His words carried the weight of genuine grief, yet Miss Marple noted the way his gaze flickered toward the open window, as if searching for an explanation, or an escape. Dr. Lionel Hayworth, still kneeling by the body, rose slowly, his face grim. "The wound is precise," he said, addressing the room. "A single thrust, directly to the heart. Death would have been instantaneous." His clinical tone contrasted sharply with the horror of the moment, and Miss Marple observed the slight tremor in his hands as he adjusted his spectacles. Major Reginald Forsyth, his face flushed from brandy and shock, cleared his throat. "Damned cowardly act, if you ask me," he blustered. "Sneaking in here, striking her down like that. Probably some vagrant from the village." His wife, Margaret, laid a restraining hand on his arm, her eyes darting nervously toward the others. Mrs. Clara Pennington, the widow, stood apart, her lips pursed in a thin line. "A vagrant," she said sharply, "in a locked manor, with servants at every door. Really, Major, you mustn't let your imagination run wild." Her tone was cutting, but Miss Marple noted the way her fingers twisted the pearls at her throat, betraying her unease. Young Timothy Blake, Charles's cousin, hovered near the door, his boyish face pale. "I heard the scream," he said almost to himself. "I was in the hall, fetching a drink. I didn't think—" His voice trailed off, and Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Timothy's hesitation suggested he had seen or heard something more than he was willing to admit. The arrival of Constable Reed and Inspector Grayson from the local police station brought a semblance of order. Inspector Grayson, a stout man with a no-nonsense demeanour, surveyed the scene with a practised eye. "Right then," he said, his voice brisk. "No one leaves this house until we've got statements from everyone. Constable, secure the room. Dr. Hayworth, any chance this was an accident?" Dr. Hayworth shook his head. "Impossible, Inspector. The angle and force of the wound suggest intent. This was murder." The word hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Inspector Grayson turned to the guests. "I'll need to know where each of you was between 9 and 9:30 this evening. Let's start with you, Mr. Ashford." Charles straightened, his jaw tight. "I was in the drawing room with the others, discussing the engagement toast with Aunt Beatrice. I stepped out briefly at around 9:15 to fetch Evelyn from the library. She said she needed a moment alone to write a letter." "And you didn't come up here with her?" Grayson pressed. "No," Charles said firmly. "I returned to the drawing room. You can ask the others." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Charles's alibi was plausible, but his quick glance toward Lady Beatrice suggested he was relying on her to confirm his story. She made a mental note to revisit this later. One by one, the guests provided their alibis. Lady Beatrice claimed to have been organising the dinner arrangements with the butler. Dr. Hayworth said he was in the billiard room with Major Forsyth, discussing a recent medical journal. Mrs. Pennington insisted she had been in the conservatory, admiring the orchids. Margaret Forsyth said she was in the drawing room, embroidering, while Timothy Blake repeated his claim of fetching a drink in the hall. Each account was delivered with varying degrees of confidence, but Miss Marple's keen ear detected the subtle hesitations, the overly rehearsed phrases, the glances exchanged between speakers. As the police began their examination of the scene, Miss Marple stepped closer to the desk, her movements unobtrusive. She noted a crumpled piece of paper half hidden beneath a book, its edge singed as if it had been held too close to the fire. She did not touch it. Inspector Grayson would not take kindly to interference, but she committed its position to memory. Nearby, a cigarette butt lay in the ashtray, its brand unfamiliar to her. She also observed a faint smudge of lipstick on the rim of a glass of water, a shade that did not match Evelyn's. "Miss Marple," Inspector Grayson said, his tone polite but firm, "I understand you have a reputation for noticing things. Care to share any observations?" Miss Marple smiled demurely. "Oh, Inspector, I'm merely an old woman who sees what others overlook. But I wonder, did you notice the window? It's open, yet the night is cold. And that letter opener, it seems rather an odd choice for a murder weapon, don't you think? So very personal." Grayson's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. "We'll look into it. For now, I'd ask you to stay with the others in the drawing room." As the guests were ushered downstairs, Miss Marple lingered a moment, her gaze resting on Evelyn's still form. "Poor child," she murmured. "You saw something, didn't you? Something someone wished to keep hidden." With a final glance at the room, she followed the others, her mind already weaving together the threads of the evening's tragedy. The murderer was among them, hidden behind a mask of civility, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover the truth, one subtle clue at a time. Chapter 3. The Arrival. The morning mist clung stubbornly to the grounds of Blackthorn Manor, weaving a ghostly veil over the manicured lawns and the ancient yew trees that stood sentinel along the drive. It was precisely 8:47 a.m. on the 23rd of August, 1925, when the crunch of gravel announced the arrival of a sleek black Daimler. The car glided to a halt before the manor's imposing oak doors, and from it emerged a figure whose very presence seemed to command the fog to part. Hercule Poirot, the renowned Belgian detective, stepped onto the drive with the precision of a man who never miscalculated a step. Captain Arthur Hastings, who had been pacing the veranda in a state of nervous agitation, hurried forward to greet his old friend. "Poirot! Thank heavens you've come," he exclaimed, his voice betraying the strain of the past 24 hours. "It's a ghastly business, simply ghastly. Poor Lady Blackthorn, murdered, and in her own home." Poirot's sharp green eyes, like those of a particularly discerning cat, surveyed Hastings with a mixture of amusement and reproach. "Mon ami," he said, adjusting the brim of his immaculate Homburg hat, "you must compose yourself. The emotions, they are understandable, but they cloud the clarity of thought. Tell me, if you please, the facts, only the facts." Hastings, chastened but eager, gestured toward the manor's entrance. "Of course, Poirot. Come inside, and I'll explain everything. The police are already here, bumbling about as usual, but they're getting nowhere fast." As they crossed the threshold into the grand hall, Poirot's gaze swept over the surroundings with the meticulousness of an artist studying a canvas. The hall was a study in opulence. A glittering chandelier hung above a polished marble floor, and portraits of stern-faced blackthorns glowered from the walls. Yet there was an unmistakable chill in the air. a sense of disruption that no amount of grandeur could mask. A constable stood awkwardly by the staircase, his notebook clutched tightly, while muffled voices drifted from the drawing room. Poirot paused, his gloved hand resting lightly on the banister. "This manor," he murmured. "It has the air of a stage, does it not? And we, Hastings, are about to witness a drama most tragic. But first, I must know the players." Hastings nodded, leading Poirot toward the library, where they could speak without interruption. As they walked, he recounted the events of the previous night with as much precision as his rattled nerves allowed. "It happened some time after midnight," he began. "Lady Evelyn Blackthorne was found dead in her private study, stabbed through the heart with a letter opener. The doctor estimates the time of death between 11:30 p.m. and 12:15 a.m. The household was in chaos. Everyone claims to have been in bed, but of course, someone's lying." Poirot's moustache twitched slightly, a sign that his little grey cells were already at work. "And the suspects, mon ami? Who resides in this maison of secrets?" Hastings ticked them off on his fingers. "There's Sir Reginald Blackthorne, Lady Evelyn's husband. He's a retired colonel, gruff but devoted to her, though they've had their quarrels. Then there's their daughter Margaret, a quiet girl, but sharp, engaged to Charles Wentworth, a charming fellow, though I hear he's got debts. The governess, Miss Clara Fielding, was here for young Thomas, the Blackthorne's 10-year-old son. She's been acting awfully nervous. Oh, and Dr. Hugh Langston, the family physician who lives on the estate. He was called immediately after the body was found. And finally, the servants, Mrs. Dutton, the housekeeper, and James, the footman. They've been with the family for years." Poirot nodded, absorbing the names as if committing them to a mental ledger. "And the police? What is their theory?" Hastings snorted. "Inspector Grayson's in charge. Decent chap, but he's got it into his head that it's a burglary gone wrong. Says some vagrant broke in, killed Lady Evelyn, and fled. Complete nonsense, if you ask me. The study wasn't ransacked, and nothing valuable was taken." "Bon," said Poirot, his tone crisp. "The inspector, he sees what is convenient, not what is true. Now, let us see this study where the tragedy occurred." They made their way upstairs, passing a maid who scurried away with a tray of tea things, her eyes red from crying. The study was a small, elegant room at the end of a long corridor, its walls lined with leather-bound books and a single window overlooking the misty gardens. The desk, a heavy mahogany affair, was disturbingly orderly, save for a small dark stain on the blotter where Lady Evelyn's blood had seeped. The letter opener, now removed by the police, had left a faint scratch on the desk surface, a silent testament to the violence that had unfolded. Poirot circled the room slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes darting from the desk to the carpet to the fireplace, where a few embers still glowed faintly. "The letter opener," he said suddenly. "It was taken from this desk, oui?" "Yes," Hastings confirmed. "It was hers, engraved with her initials, E.B. The police found it beside her body." "And the window?" Poirot gestured toward the heavy drapes. "Locked tight," Hastings said. "No signs of forced entry. The door was locked too, but the key was on the inside." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Locked, you say? Yet someone entered and left without disturbing the lock. Most curious." He knelt by the desk, examining the scratch mark with a magnifying glass he produced from his waistcoat pocket. "This mark, it is precise, is it not? Not the wild thrust of a panicked burglar. No, this was deliberate, controlled." He straightened, dusting off his knees with a fastidious flick of his handkerchief. And where was everyone at the time of the murder? Their alibis, if you please. Hastings hesitated, piecing together the statements he'd overheard. Sir Reginald says he was in his bedroom, reading. Margaret claims she was asleep in her room. Charles Wentworth was in the billiard room, alone, practicing shots. Miss Fielding was in the nursery with Thomas, though the boy was already asleep. Dr. Langston says he was in his cottage on the grounds, writing letters. Mrs. Dutton and James both claim they were in their quarters, below stairs. Poirot's lips pursed. Everyone alone, or with an alibi that cannot be verified. How convenient! He turned to the constable, who had followed them into the room. "Monsieur, may I see the body?" The constable, a young man with a nervous stammer, nodded. "It's in the parlour, sir. The doctor's with her now." They descended to the parlour, where Lady Evelyn's body lay covered with a sheet. Dr. Langston, a wiry man with tired eyes, stood nearby, his hands clasped tightly. Poirot lifted the sheet with care, revealing Lady Evelyn's pale face, her expression frozen in a look of surprise rather than fear. The wound just below her left breast was clean and precise. "Mon Dieu," Poirot murmured. "This was no accident. The thrust was expert, straight to the heart. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." Dr. Langston cleared his throat. "It was instantaneous, Mr. Poirot. She wouldn't have suffered." Poirot's gaze lingered on the body, then flicked to the doctor. "You were close to Lady Evelyn, were you not, Doctor? A trusted confidant, perhaps?" Langston flushed. "I was her physician, nothing more. I've known the family for years." "Of course," Poirot said smoothly, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of interest. "And you were in your cottage at the time of the murder, writing letters, I believe." "Yes," Langston said, a touch too quickly, "to a colleague in London." Poirot nodded, but his silence was more probing than any question. He turned to Hastings. "Mon ami, I must speak with each member of this household. Their words, their gestures, their contradictions, these will tell us more than any footprint or fingerprint." As they left the parlour, Poirot paused in the hallway, his head tilted as if listening to the house itself. "This manor, Hastings, it is full of secrets, but secrets, they have a way of whispering to Hercule Poirot, and I always listen." The fog outside had begun to lift, but within Blackthorn Manor the shadows seemed to deepen, as if the house itself knew that the truth was only just beginning to stir. Chapter 4. The questions begin. The morning sun, now free of the mist, cast long golden fingers through the tall windows of Blackthorn Manor's drawing-room, illuminating the sombre gathering within. It was 10:15 a.m., and Hercule Poirot stood at the centre of the room, his small, immaculate figure a stark contrast to the heavy oak furniture and the air of unease that hung over the occupants. The household had assembled at his request, each member seated in a semicircle of high-backed chairs, their faces a study in guarded apprehension. Captain Hastings stood by the fireplace, his arms crossed, watching his friend with a mixture of admiration and impatience. Poirot's sharp green eyes moved from one face to another, lingering just long enough to unsettle. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice calm but commanding, A tragedy has occurred in this house. Lady Evelyn Blackthorne, a woman of grace and distinction, has been taken from us by an act most foul. Murder. It is not a word to be spoken lightly. Yet it is the truth. And I, Hercule Poirot, have been called to uncover the hand that wielded the blade. A ripple of discomfort passed through the room. Sir Reginald Blackthorne, seated stiffly in a leather armchair, cleared his throat. "See here, Mr. Poirot. I appreciate your reputation, but the police are handling this. Surely it was some drifter, some outsider?" Poirot raised a gloved hand, silencing him. "Non, Sir Reginald. The theory of the outsider, it is convenient, but it does not satisfy. The door to the study was locked from the inside, the window secured. No, the answer lies within these walls, among those who knew Lady Evelyn best." His gaze swept the room again. "And so I must ask questions, I must probe, and you, all of you, will answer with the truth, or the truth will reveal itself in other ways." He began with Sir Reginald, whose ruddy face betrayed a flicker of indignation. "Sir Reginald, you were in your bedroom at the time of the murder, reading, oui? What book, if I may ask?" Sir Reginald blinked, caught off guard. A military history. Wellington's campaigns. Don't see how that's relevant." Poirot's moustache twitched. "Everything is relevant, monsieur." "And at what time did you retire to your room?" "About 10 o'clock, Sir Reginald replied gruffly. "Evelyn was still in the drawing-room then, chatting with Margaret and that Wentworth fellow." Poirot nodded, turning to Margaret Blackthorne, whose pale hands were clasped tightly in her lap. Her dark eyes, red-rimmed from grief, met his with a quiet intensity. "Mademoiselle Margaret, you were with your mother in the drawing-room until what hour?" 10:30, Margaret said softly. "I went to bed shortly after. Mother said she had some letters to write in her study. And you heard nothing unusual? No footsteps? No cries?" Margaret shook her head. "Nothing. My room is at the far end of the corridor." Poirot's gaze shifted to Charles Wentworth, who lounged in his chair with an air of forced nonchalance. His tailored suit was impeccable, but his fingers drummed nervously on the armrest. "Monsieur Wentworth, you were in the billiard-room, practicing shots, alone, at the time of the murder. A curious choice for so late an hour, non?" Charles flashed a disarming smile. "I couldn't sleep, Mr. Poirot. Billiards helps me think. I was there from about 10 until well past midnight." "And you saw no one? Heard no one?" "Not a soul," Charles said, his smile faltering slightly under Poirot's unblinking stare. Poirot moved on to Miss Clara Fielding, the governess, whose nervous fidgeting with her handkerchief betrayed her unease. "Mademoiselle Fielding, you were in the nursery with young Master Thomas. He was asleep, you say?" "Yes," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. "I stayed with him until after midnight, reading by lamplight. He's been restless since it happened." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And the nursery? It is close to the study, is it not? You heard nothing?" Clara hesitated, her fingers twisting the handkerchief into knots. "No, nothing unusual. Just the usual creaks of the house." Dr. Hugh Langston was next, his tired eyes meeting Poirot's with a hint of defiance. "Doctor, you were in your cottage, writing letters. To whom, if I may inquire?" "A colleague in London," Langston repeated, his tone clipped. "Dr. Mortimer, about a medical conference. I posted the letter this morning." "Most diligent," Poirot said, his tone neutral, but his eyes keen. "And you returned to the manor when?" when James, the footman, fetched me around 12:30. I came at once to examine Lady Evelyn. Finally, Poirot turned to the servants. Mrs. Dutton, the housekeeper, sat ramrod straight, her severe black dress accentuating her air of authority. James, the footman, stood at the back, his youthful face pale but composed. "Mrs. Dutton, you and James were in your quarters below stairs. You heard nothing, saw nothing?" "Indeed, sir," Mrs. Dutton said firmly. "We retire early in this house. The servants' quarters are far from the study, and the walls are thick." James nodded in agreement, though his eyes darted nervously to the floor. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back, pacing slowly before the group. "Merci, all of you. Your answers, they are most illuminating. But let us be clear. Someone in this house knows more than they have said. A locked room, a single fatal wound, a letter opener from the victim's own desk. These are not the work of chance. They are the work of a mind that plans, a mind that deceives." A tense silence followed. Inspector Grayson, who had been lingering near the door, coughed awkwardly. "Mr. Poirot, we've searched the grounds. No sign of an intruder, but we did find this." He held up a small sealed envelope. It was in Lady Evelyn's desk, addressed to you. Poirot's eyebrows rose as he took the envelope, his gloved fingers handling it with care. The handwriting was elegant, unmistakably Lady Evelyn's, and the wax seal bore her initials, E.B. He broke the seal and withdrew a single sheet of paper, reading it silently. His expression remained impassive, but Hastings, standing close, noticed a faint tightening of his jaw. "What is it, Poirot?" Hastings asked, unable to contain his curiosity. Poirot folded the letter and tucked it into his waistcoat pocket. "It is a request, mon ami. Lady Evelyn wished for my presence here, even before her death. She wrote of a matter most urgent, a fear that someone in this house meant her harm." A gasp rippled through the room. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, and Sir Reginald's face reddened. "Preposterous!" he barked. "Evelyn never mentioned any such thing to me." "Perhaps," Poirot said softly. "She did not trust you to listen." The words hung in the air, sharp as the letter opener that had ended Lady Evelyn's life. Poirot turned to Inspector Grayson. "Monsieur, I should like to examine this study again, and the grounds. There are details, small details, that the police may have overlooked." Grayson bristled but nodded. "Very well, Mr. Poirot, but don't expect miracles. This case is as tight as a drum." Poirot smiled faintly. "A drum, Inspector, may seem solid, but it is hollow inside, and it is in the hollows that I, Hercule Poirot, find the truth." As the group dispersed, Poirot lingered, his eyes scanning the room once more. He paused by a small side table, where a vase of roses stood, their petals wilting slightly. One petal lay on the table, detached, and beside it, almost imperceptible, was a faint smudge of ash. Poirot bent closer, his magnifying glass glinting in the sunlight. "Hastings," he murmured, "do you smell it?" "The faintest trace of tobacco. Yet no one's in this room admitted to smoking last night." Hastings frowned. Could it be from earlier? A guest, perhaps? "Perhaps," Poirot said, but his tone suggested otherwise. "Or perhaps it is a whisper from the truth, waiting to be heard." As they left the drawing-room, the weight of Poirot's words settled over Hastings like the fog that had cloaked the manor that morning. The questions had begun, but the answers, it seemed, were still hiding in the shadows of Blackthorn Manor. Chapter 5. The Red Herrings. The clock in the grand hall of Blackthorn Manor struck noon, its chimes resonating through the heavy silence that had settled over the household. The sun, now high, pierced the tall windows, casting stark shadows across the polished floors, but the warmth did little to dispel the chill of suspicion that clung to every corner. Hercule Poirot, having concluded his initial interviews, stood in the study once more, his gloved hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed on the desk where Lady Evelyn Blackthorn had met her end. Captain Hastings hovered nearby, his brow furrowed with impatience, eager for some revelation to break the oppressive quiet. "Poirot," Hastings ventured, "you've spoken to everyone, examined the study, and found that smudge of ash. Surely you've formed some theory by now?" Poirot's moustache twitched, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Mon ami, a theory is like a house of cards. Build it too quickly, and it collapses. No, I observe, I listen, I collect. The truth, it is there, but it hides behind the distractions, what do you English call them? Red herrings." Hastings frowned. "Red herrings? You mean someone's deliberately misleading us?" "Précisément," Poirot said, his voice soft but certain. "In a case such as this, where all are suspects and none are without motive, the guilty will cast shadows to obscure their path. Come, let us see what the good Inspector Grayson has uncovered. His efforts, I suspect, will point us to these very distractions." They found Inspector Grayson in the library, poring over a notebook filled with scrawled observations. The room smelled faintly of old leather and wax polish, and a map of the manor's grounds lay spread across a table, marked with X's and arrows. Grayson looked up, his face a mixture of frustration and grudging respect. "Mr. Poirot, I've got something you might find interesting. We've had a breakthrough." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "A breakthrough, Inspector. Do enlighten me." Grayson gestured to the map. "One of the groundskeepers found a footprint in the flower bed beneath the study window. Size 10, man's boot, fresh from last night. And there's more. A scrap of cloth caught on the rose bushes nearby. Blue wool, torn like from a jacket. I'd wager it's our man, the intruder who slipped in and out." Hastings leaned forward, his eyes bright with excitement. "That's it, then! The burglar theory holds water after all." Poirot, however, remained unmoved, his gaze fixed on the map. "This footprint, Inspector, it is clear, well defined." "Clear as day," Grayson said, producing a photograph of the print, a deep impression in the soft earth. "And the cloth, here it is." He held up a small evidence bag containing a ragged blue scrap, no larger than a postage stamp. Poirot examined the cloth through his magnifying glass, his expression inscrutable. "And you believe this points to an outsider, a stranger who scaled the wall, entered a locked room, and left no trace save this convenient footprint and cloth?" Grayson bristled. "It's solid evidence, Mr. Poirot. More than you've turned up with all your questions." Poirot's smile was polite but sharp. "Evidence, Inspector, is only as solid as the mind that interprets it. Tell me, was the ground beneath the window disturbed elsewhere? Signs of a ladder, perhaps, or other prints?" Grayson hesitated. "Well, no, just the one print. But it's enough to start a search. I've got men combing the village for anyone matching that boot size." "Bon," Poirot said, though his tone suggested anything but approval. "And the cloth? It is distinctive? A rare fabric, perhaps?" "Common enough," Grayson admitted. "Could be from any working man's jacket." Poirot nodded, handing the bag back. "Then let us consider this footprint and cloth not as the solution, but as pieces in a larger puzzle. I should like to speak with the groundskeeper who found them." The groundskeeper, a weathered man named Mr. Perkins, was summoned to the library. He stood twisting his cap in his hands, his eyes darting nervously between Poirot and Grayson. "Found it this morning, sir," he said, addressing Poirot. "Right under the study window, plain as anything. Didn't see it last night when I did my rounds at 10. "And the cloth?" Poirot asked. "You found it precisely where?" "Caught on the roses, sir, just a few feet from the print. Looked fresh, like it had been torn off recent-like." Poirot thanked him and dismissed him, then turned to Hastings. "What do you make of this, mon ami?" Hastings scratched his chin. Seemed straightforward enough. Someone was outside, tried to get in, left a footprint and tore their jacket. Maybe they didn't get in through the window, but it's proof someone was lurking. "Proof, perhaps," Poirot said, "but of what? A footprint that is too perfect, a cloth that is too conveniently placed. These are not the marks of a careless intruder, but of a mind that wishes us to look in a certain direction. A red herring, Hastings, designed to lead us astray." Before Hastings could respond, a commotion in the hall drew their attention. Charles Wentworth burst into the library, his face flushed with agitation. "Inspector Mr. Poirot, you've got to see this. I found something in the billiard room, something you'll want to know about." Poirot and Hastings followed Charles, with Grayson trailing behind, muttering about civilians interfering. In the billiard room, a cavernous space with green baize tables and polished cues, Charles pointed to a corner near the window. "There, under the table. I noticed it when I was tidying up." Poirot knelt, his movements precise, and retrieved a small object. A cigarette case, silver, engraved with the initials CW. He opened it to reveal a half-dozen cigarettes, one of which bore a faint smudge of lipstick on the filter. Hastings gasped. "Good Lord, Charles, is that yours?" Charles nodded, his jaw tight. "Yes, but I swear I didn't leave it there last night. I always keep it in my pocket. Someone must have taken it, planted it here." Grayson seized the case, his eyes narrowing. "Lipstick, eh? And you were in here alone, you said? Practicing shots? Sounds like you had company, Mr. Wentworth." Charles's face reddened. "That's absurd. I was alone, I tell you." Poirot held up a hand. "Calm yourself, Monsieur Wentworth. This case, it is yours, yet you claim it was not here last night. Curious. And the lipstick, does it belong to anyone in this house?" Charles hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the door. I wouldn't know. Margaret doesn't smoke, and I've never seen Miss Fielding with a cigarette. It could be anyone's." Poirot's gaze lingered on him, then shifted to the case. "The ash I found in the drawing-room, it smelled of tobacco. Perhaps this cigarette case will tell us more than its owner intends." Grayson snorted. "This is no red herring, Mr. Poirot. Wentworth's got no alibi, and now we've got his cigarette case near the scene, with lipstick that suggests an assignation. I'd say we've got our man." Poirot's smile was enigmatic. "Perhaps, Inspector, but the truth, it is not so easily caught. This case, this footprint, this cloth, they are all distractions, pointing us toward the obvious while the subtle remains hidden. I must think, I must reflect." As they left the billiard room, Poirot paused by the window, his eyes scanning the garden below. "Hastings," he murmured, "the red herrings, they multiply." But Hercule Poirot is not so easily led astray. The truth, it is like a melody. Beneath the noise, it waits to be heard. The afternoon stretched ahead, heavy with questions. And as the household dispersed, each member cast sidelong glances at the others, the weight of suspicion growing heavier with every step. Chapter 6. A Clue in Detail. The afternoon light filtered through the heavy drapes of Blackthorn Manor's drawing room, casting a muted glow over the ornate furniture and the tense faces of its occupants. It was 2:17 p.m. on August 23rd, 1925, and Hercule Poirot stood by the fireplace, his small, meticulous figure a beacon of calm amid the storm of suspicion that swirled through the house. Captain Hastings, leaning against a bookcase, watched his friend with a mixture of anticipation and frustration, eager for the moment when Poirot's little grey cells would unravel the knot of this perplexing murder. Poirot's sharp eyes, ever observant, had been drawn to the smallest details since his arrival, and now, as he surveyed the room, his gaze settled on a seemingly trivial object. A silver cigarette lighter, engraved with a delicate floral pattern, resting on a side table beside a vase of wilting roses. It was the same table where he had found the smudge of ash that morning, and the lighter's presence struck him as significant. He lifted it with gloved fingers, turning it over in the light. "Hastings," he said softly, "do you recall anyone in this household admitting to smoking? Or perhaps owning such a lighter?" Hastings frowned, racking his memory. "No one mentioned smoking, Poirot. Charles Wentworth's cigarette case had that lipstick mark, but he swore he didn't leave it in the billiard room, and no one's claimed a lighter." "Précisément," Poirot murmured, his voice laced with satisfaction. "Yet here it is, a lighter, placed so casually, yet so deliberately. And the ash, its scent matches that of the cigarette in Monsieur Wentworth's case. A coincidence? No. Hercule Poirot does not believe in coincidences." He slipped the lighter into his pocket and turned to Inspector Grayson, who had just entered. His face flushed from a fruitless search of the village for the owner of the mysterious footprint. "Inspector, I should like to revisit the study. There is a detail, a small inconsistency, that troubles me." Grayson sighed but nodded. "Very well, Mr. Poirot, but I'm telling you that footprint and cloth are our best leads. We've got men checking every tailor in the county for that blue wool." Poirot's smile was polite but inscrutable. "Your diligence is commendable, Inspector. But let us examine the scene of the crime once more. The truth, it often hides in the smallest of details." They ascended the grand staircase, the air growing heavier with each step toward Lady Evelyn's study. The room was as they had left it. The mahogany desk with its faint bloodstain, the locked window, the orderly bookshelves. Poirot moved to the desk, his movements precise, and knelt to examine the scratch mark left by the letter opener. He traced it with a gloved finger, his eyes narrowing. "Hastings," he said, "observe this mark. It is shallow, yes? Not the wild gouge of a struggle, but a deliberate stroke. And yet, the letter opener was found beside the body, not embedded in the desk. Why then this scratch?" Hastings peered over his shoulder. "Perhaps she grabbed it to defend herself, and it scraped the desk in the scuffle." Poirot shook his head. "Non, mon ami. Lady Evelyn's wound was precise, instantaneous. There was no scuffle. The killer struck once, with certainty. This scratch, it is a clue, but not to the act of murder. It is something else, something misplaced." He straightened, his gaze drifting to the fireplace, where the embers had long since died. A faint trace of ash lingered on the hearth, and Poirot's eyes gleamed with sudden interest. He crouched, retrieving a small charred fragment of paper from the grate. It was no larger than a postage stamp, but the edge bore the faint trace of handwriting. "Mon Dieu," he whispered, holding it to the light. "A fragment burned, but not entirely destroyed. The ink, it is blue, not black. Most unusual for Lady Evelyn, who preferred black ink for her correspondence." Hastings leaned closer, his excitement mounting. "A letter, then? Something she was writing before she was killed?" "Perhaps," Poirot said, slipping the fragment into a small envelope. "Or perhaps something someone wished to destroy. We must have it analysed, but first I must speak with Mrs. Dutton, the housekeeper. Her knowledge of this house, it is unparalleled." They found Mrs. Dutton in the kitchen, overseeing the preparation of a sombre luncheon. Her severe black dress and tightly pinned hair gave her the air of a woman who brooked no nonsense. But her hands trembled slightly as she arranged a tray of sandwiches. "Mrs. Dutton," Poirot began, his tone courteous but firm, "you have served the Blackthorns for many years, You know their habits, their routines. Tell me, did Lady Evelyn ever use blue ink in her correspondence?" Mrs. Dutton's eyes widened slightly, but she recovered quickly. "Blue ink? No, sir. Lady Evelyn was particular. Always black ink, always her favourite fountain pen. She said blue was too frivolous." Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. "And the fireplace in the study, when was it last cleaned?" "Yesterday morning, sir," Mrs. Dutton replied. "I cleaned it myself before Lady Evelyn began her work. There was nothing but fresh logs by evening." "Merci, Mrs. Dutton," Poirot said, dismissing her with a nod. As she returned to her duties, he turned to Hastings, his voice low. "The ash in the fireplace, the burned fragment with blue ink, these are not the work of Lady Evelyn. Someone used that fire to conceal something, and in their haste they left a trace." Hastings's eyes widened. "You think the killer burned a letter? To cover their tracks?" "Perhaps," Poirot said, "but it is the timing that intrigues me. The fire was lit after Mrs. Dutton cleaned the hearth, yet before the murder. Why burn a paper then, unless it was to prepare the stage for what was to come?" Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp cry from the hall. Margaret Blackthorne stood at the foot of the stairs, her face pale, clutching a small leather-bound book. "Mr. Poirot," she called, her voice trembling. "I found this in Mother's dressing-table. It's her diary, but the last page is torn out." Poirot took the diary with care, flipping to the final entry, dated the day before the murder. The handwriting was Lady Evelyn's, neat and precise, but the jagged edge of a missing page was unmistakable. "What did it say, Mademoiselle Margaret?" he asked gently. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't read it all, but the last line I saw, it said, 'I know the truth, and I fear it will destroy us all.'" A heavy silence fell. Inspector Grayson, who had joined them, snorted. "Sounds like a motive to me. Someone didn't want that truth getting out." Poirot's gaze was distant, his mind clearly racing. "The truth, Inspector, is like a shadow. It shifts, it conceals, but it cannot be erased. This diary, this burned fragment, this scratch on the desk, they are threads in a tapestry. And I, Hercule Poirot, shall weave them together." As they returned to the drawing-room, Poirot paused by the side table, retrieving the silver lighter from his pocket. He held it up, its floral pattern catching the light. "This lighter," he murmured. "It is a small thing, yet it speaks. Someone in this house smokes, yet denies it. Someone burned a paper, yet claims the fire was untouched. Someone scratched a desk, yet the weapon was not embedded. These are not accidents, Hastings. They are the fingerprints of a mind that seeks to deceive." The afternoon wore on, and the manor seemed to close in around them, its walls whispering secrets that Poirot was determined to uncover. The clue in detail had emerged, but its meaning remained tantalizingly out of reach. A puzzle piece waiting to be placed in the intricate design of Blackthorn Manor's darkest night. Chapter 7. More Lies Surface. The late afternoon sun cast long slanting rays across the gardens of Blackthorn Manor, painting the lawns in hues of gold and shadow. It was 4:32 p.m. on August 23rd, 1925, and within the manor's walls the atmosphere grew heavier with each passing hour, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Hercule Poirot sat in the library, the silver cigarette lighter and the charred fragment of paper resting on the table before him, their significance still veiled in mystery. Captain Hastings stood by the window, his restlessness palpable, while Inspector Grayson lingered near the door, his notebook open, but his patience visibly fraying. "Poirot," Hastings said, turning from the window, "that diary entry of Lady Evelyn's, I know the truth, and I fear it will destroy us all. It's chilling. Surely it points to someone in this house, someone she trusted." Poirot's green eyes gleamed with quiet intensity. "Oui, mon ami. The diary. It is a window into her mind, but a window half-shuttered. The missing page, the burned fragment, these are not accidents. Someone sought to silence Lady Evelyn, not only in death, but in what she left behind. We must now uncover the lies that hide the truth." Before he could elaborate, a soft knock interrupted them. Miss Clara Fielding, the governess, stood in the doorway, her pale face framed by the severe bun of her hair. Her hands clutched a folded piece of cloth, and her eyes darted nervously between Poirot and Grayson. "Mr. Poirot," she said, her voice trembling, I must speak with you. It's important." Poirot gestured to a chair. "Please, Mademoiselle Fielding, sit. You have something to share, oui?" Clara hesitated, then perched on the edge of the seat, her fingers twisting the cloth, a handkerchief, Poirot noted, embroidered with her initials CF. "I wasn't entirely truthful this morning," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I did hear something last night from the nursery, a noise like a door creaking, around 11:30. It came from the direction of Lady Evelyn's study." Hastings leaned forward, his eyes wide. "Why didn't you say so earlier, Miss Fielding?" "This could be critical." Clara's cheeks flushed. "I was afraid. I didn't want to seem suspicious. I'm only the governess, after all. But after finding that diary, I couldn't keep silent, and there's more." She unfolded the handkerchief, revealing a small gold cufflink, engraved with a monogram, HL. "I found this in the nursery this morning, under Thomas's bed. It's not mine, and Thomas doesn't wear such things." Poirot took the cufflink, examining it with his magnifying glass. "HL," he murmured. "Dr. Hugh Langston, perhaps. Most interesting. And you found this after the murder, you say?" Clara nodded, her eyes downcast. "Yes, sir. I didn't think much of it at first, but it doesn't belong in the nursery." Grayson snatched the cufflink, his expression triumphant. "Langston, eh?" He said he was in his cottage all night, writing letters. This puts him in the manor near the study. I'll have him brought in at once." Poirot raised a hand. "Patience, Inspector. A cufflink. It is a clue, but it is not a confession. We must ask Dr. Langston to explain himself. But we must also consider why Mademoiselle Fielding brings this to us now. The timing, it is suggestive." Clara's eyes widened, but she said nothing. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Poirot dismissed her with a nod, then turned to Hastings. "The lies, they begin to surface, mon ami, but each lie is a thread, leading us deeper into the web." Dr. Langston was summoned, his face pale but composed as he entered the library. He glanced at the cufflink in Grayson's hand, and a flicker of unease crossed his features. "What's this about, Inspector?" he asked, his voice steady but strained. Grayson held up the cufflink. "This was found in the nursery, Doctor. Langston? Care to explain how it got there when you claimed to be in your cottage all night?" Langston's jaw tightened. "That's mine, yes, but I haven't worn those cufflinks in weeks. I must have lost it earlier, perhaps when I visited Thomas for his checkup last week." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And yet, Doctor, the nursery floor is swept daily, is it not? Mrs. Dutton is most fastidious. How then does this cufflink appear only now?" Langston hesitated, his fingers twitching at his side. I can't explain it. Someone must have placed it there." Grayson snorted. "Convenient, that. First Wentworth's cigarette case, now your cufflink. Everyone's losing things, it seems." Poirot's gaze was unrelenting. "Doctor, you were close to Lady Evelyn. Did she ever confide in you about a secret? A truth she feared would destroy us all?" Langston's face darkened. "She was my patient, Mr. Poirot. She trusted me with her health, not her secrets. If she had such fears, she kept them from me." Poirot nodded, but his silence was more probing than any question. As Langston left, Poirot turned to the table, picking up the charred fragment of paper once more. "The blue ink," he murmured. "Dr. Langston, he writes to his colleague in blue ink, does he not? He said so this morning." Hastings's eyes lit up. "You think the burned paper was his? A letter, perhaps, that Lady Evelyn found?" "Perhaps," Poirot said, his tone cautious. "But we must not leap to conclusions. The cufflink, the paper, the creak of a door, these are pieces of a puzzle. But the picture is not yet clear." Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden commotion from the hall. Sir Reginald Blackthorne stormed in, his face red with anger, followed by Charles Wentworth, whose usual charm was replaced by a defensive scowl. "Mr. Poirot," Sir Reginald bellowed, "this young man has been lying to us all. I overheard him just now, talking to Margaret, admitting he wasn't in the billiard room the entire time last night." Charles's hands clenched into fists. "That's not what I said, sir. I told Margaret I stepped out for a moment to get some air on the terrace. I was back in the billiard room by 11. Poirot's eyebrows rose. "The terrace, Monsieur Wentworth. It is near the study window, is it not? And you did not mention this before. Why?" Charles's bravado faltered. I didn't think it mattered. I was only out there for a few minutes. I didn't see or hear anything." Poirot's gaze was piercing. "And yet you neglected to mention this few minutes until now. A lie of omission, perhaps, but a lie nonetheless." Sir Reginald's voice trembled with rage. "He's hiding something, Poirot. I've never trusted him. Always sniffing around Margaret, and with debts up to his ears. Evelyn warned me about him, you know. Said he was trouble." Poirot's expression remained impassive. "Merci, Sir Reginald. Your candour is noted. Monsieur Wentworth, you will remain available for further questions." As the two men left, Hastings shook his head. "Good Lord, Poirot, it's one lie after another. Langston's cufflink, Wentworth's terrace stroll, everyone's got something to hide." "Oui," Poirot said, his voice soft but resolute. "The lies they multiply, but they are clumsy. The cufflink is too conveniently found. The terrace visit, too, belatedly revealed. Someone in this house is weaving a tapestry of deception, but the threads they are fraying. We must pull at them, Hastings, until the truth is laid bare." He returned to the table, his fingers brushing the silver lighter. "And this lighter," he murmured, "it still whispers to me. Its owner, I think, will not remain silent for long." As the afternoon faded into evening, the manor seemed to pulse with secrets, each revelation pulling Poirot closer to the heart of the mystery, and yet the final truth remained just beyond his grasp, hidden in the tangled web of lies that Blackthorn Manor held so tightly. Chapter 8. The Emotional Turning Point. The twilight of August 23rd, 1925, draped Blackthorn Manor in a sombre veil, the last rays of sunlight retreating behind the yew trees as shadows lengthened across the estate. It was 6:43 p.m., and the oppressive weight of suspicion had seeped into every corner of the house, fraying nerves and loosening tongues. Hercule Poirot sat in the drawing-room, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his sharp green eyes observing the subtle tremors in the faces of the household. Captain Hastings stood by the window, his silhouette tense against the fading light, while Inspector Grayson paced near the door, his earlier confidence now tinged with exasperation. The revelations of the day, the cufflink, the burned paper, Charles Wentworth's belated admission, had tightened the noose of suspicion, and Poirot sensed that the moment was ripe for a crack in the carefully constructed facades of Blackthorn Manor's inhabitants. "Mon ami," he said to Hastings, his voice low, "the heart, it is a fragile thing. Under pressure, it breaks, and in breaking, it reveals. Tonight, we shall apply that pressure." Before Hastings could respond, a stifled sob echoed from the hall. Margaret Blackthorn appeared in the doorway, her face pale and streaked with tears, her hands clutching the leather-bound diary she had found earlier. Her dark eyes, usually so composed, were wild with grief. "Mr. Poirot," she gasped, her voice breaking, "I can't bear it any longer. I've read more of Mother's diary, and there's something you must know." Poirot rose, his movements deliberate, and gestured to a chair. "Mademoiselle Margaret, please, sit. You are distressed, but you must share what you have discovered. The truth, it is the only path to justice for your mother." Margaret sank into the chair, her hands trembling as she opened the diary to a page near the end. "It's not just the missing page," she said, her voice barely audible. "Mother wrote about a betrayal. She suspected someone in this house was stealing from her, siphoning money from the estate. She didn't name them, but she wrote that she confronted them 2 days ago, and they begged her to keep silent." A hush fell over the room. Inspector Grayson stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing. "Stealing, you say? That's a motive for murder, if ever I heard one. Who was it, Miss Blackthorn? Did she give any hint?" Margaret shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "No, she didn't say who, but she wrote that she feared for her life, that this person was desperate, and she mentioned a meeting late at night in her study, the night she died." Poirot's moustache twitched, his mind racing. "A meeting, you say? This is most significant, mademoiselle. Did she mention a time, or any detail of this rendezvous?" Margaret flipped back a page, her fingers shaking. She wrote, "I will meet them at 11 to settle this once and for all. I pray I am wrong, but I fear the worst." That's all. The next page is torn out. Hastings gasped. 11 o'clock? That's just before the time of death. Whoever she met must be the killer. Poirot's eyes gleamed with quiet intensity. Perhaps, Hastings, but we must not assume. The diary, it tells us of Lady Evelyn's fears, but it does not name her betrayer. We must look to the actions, the inconsistencies, to find the truth. He turned to Margaret, his voice gentle but probing. "Mademoiselle, why did you not share this earlier? This diary, it is a key to your mother's final hours." Margaret's sob caught in her throat. "I was afraid," she whispered. "Afraid of what it meant, of who it might point to. Mother was so private, and I didn't want to believe anyone here could do this." Poirot nodded, his expression softening. "Your loyalty, it is commendable, but the truth, it demands courage. Merci, mademoiselle. You have done well to come forward." As Margaret left, her shoulders hunched with grief, Poirot turned to Grayson. "Inspector, this meeting at 11 o'clock, it changes the picture, does it not? We must re-examine the alibis, particularly those who claim to be alone at that hour." Grayson nodded, flipping open his notebook. Wentworth was on the terrace, Langston in his cottage, Sir Reginald reading, Miss Fielding in the nursery, and the servants below stairs. But if Lady Evelyn was meeting someone, one of them's lying through their teeth. Poirot's gaze drifted to the side table, where the silver cigarette lighter still lay, its floral pattern catching the dim light. "The lighter," he murmured, "and the ash. They are connected to this meeting, I am certain. We must find its owner." Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock. Mrs. Dutton, the housekeeper, entered, her face ashen. "Mr. Poirot, sir. I must speak. It's about Miss Fielding. I saw her last night near the study just before midnight. She wasn't in the nursery as she claimed." Poirot's eyebrows rose. "Indeed, Mrs. Dutton, this is a serious accusation. You are certain of the time?" Mrs. Dutton nodded. Her lips pursed. "I'd gone to check the linens in the upstairs closet, sir, at 11:45. I saw Miss Fielding coming down the corridor from the direction of the study. She looked frightened, sir, and she hurried away when she saw me." Hastings's eyes widened. "Good Lord, Poirot! That puts Miss Fielding at the scene right around the time of the murder." Poirot's expression remained impassive. "Merci, Mrs. Dutton. Your observation is most valuable. Please send Miss Fielding to us." Clara Fielding entered moments later, her face pale and her hands twisting her embroidered handkerchief. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Poirot?" she asked, her voice trembling. Poirot's gaze was unrelenting. "Mademoiselle Fielding, you told us you were in the nursery all evening, yet Mrs. Dutton saw you near the study at 11:45. This is a contradiction, no? Why were you there?" Clara's eyes filled with tears, and she sank into a chair, her composure crumbling. I didn't want to say," she sobbed. "I was afraid. I went to the study to speak with Lady Evelyn. I'd overheard her arguing with someone earlier that day. Angry voices, though I couldn't make out the words. I wanted to ask if she was all right, but when I got to the study, the door was locked. I knocked, but there was no answer. I left and went back to the nursery." Poirot's voice was calm but piercing. "And this argument, mademoiselle, who was it with? Did you recognize the voice?" Clara shook her head, her sobs growing louder. "I couldn't tell. It was muffled, but it was a man's voice, I'm sure. I didn't want to pry, but Lady Evelyn sounded so upset. I thought I could help." Grayson snorted. "And you didn't think to mention this earlier?" Sounds like you're covering for someone, Miss Fielding. Or for yourself." Clara's head snapped up, her eyes flashing with indignation. "I'm not a murderer. I cared for Lady Evelyn. I only wanted to protect her." Poirot raised a hand, silencing Grayson. "Enough, mademoiselle. Your distress, it is genuine, but your silence has cost us time. You will remain available for further questions." As Clara left, her sobs echoing down the hall, Poirot turned to Hastings. "The emotional turning point, mon ami." Miss Fielding breaks, and in doing so, she reveals a piece of the truth, an argument, a locked door, a man's voice. But whose? And why did Lady Evelyn fear betrayal? Hastings shook his head. "It's a tangle, Poirot. Clara's story, Margaret's diary, Langston's cufflink, Wentworth's terrace stroll. Everyone's hiding something." "We?" Poirot said, his voice soft but resolute. "But the lies, they are cracking under the weight of their own contradictions. The truth, it is close, Hastings. We must press harder, for the heart of Blackthorn Manor is ready to confess." As the evening deepened, the manor seemed to pulse with the weight of unspoken truths, each revelation drawing Poirot closer to the killer, and to the secret that Lady Evelyn had died to protect. Chapter 9. The Trap. The evening of August 23rd, 1925, settled over Blackthorn Manor like a heavy curtain. The air thick with the scent of impending rain, and the unspoken tensions of its inhabitants. It was 8:12 p.m., and the grand dining room, with its long mahogany table and flickering candelabras, had been transformed into a stage for Hercule Poirot's next move. The household had been summoned to dine together at his request, a seemingly innocuous gathering that Poirot intended to use as a crucible to forge the truth. Captain Hastings sat to his right, his face a mask of anticipation, while Inspector Grayson, reluctantly present, glowered from the far end of the table. The suspects, Sir Reginald Blackthorne, Margaret Blackthorne, Charles Wentworth, Dr. Hugh Langston, Miss Clara Fielding, Mrs. Dutton, and James the footman, sat in uneasy silence, their eyes darting to Poirot as if sensing the trap being set. Poirot, impeccable in his black dinner jacket, rose with a deliberate grace, his small stature somehow commanding the room. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice clear and measured, "we are gathered here not merely to dine, but to confront the shadow that hangs over Blackthorn Manor. Lady Evelyn Blackthorne was murdered, and the killer sits among us. Tonight, I, Hercule Poirot, shall apply the pressure of logic and observation to reveal what has been so carefully hidden." A murmur of unease rippled through the room. Sir Reginald's fork clattered against his plate, and Margaret's hand tightened around her glass. Poirot's green eyes swept over them, noting every gesture, every flicker of expression. "Let us begin," he continued, "with a simple fact. Lady Evelyn was expecting a visitor to her study at 11 o'clock on the night of her death. She wrote of this meeting in her diary, fearing betrayal. Yet each of you claims to have been elsewhere. One of you lies." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Charles Wentworth shifted uncomfortably, his charm replaced by a defensive edge. "I've told you, Mr. Poirot. I was on the terrace for a few minutes, then back in the billiard room. I didn't see Lady Evelyn." Poirot's smile was faint but sharp. "Indeed, Monsieur Wentworth. Yet your cigarette case, with its telltale lipstick, was found in the billiard room. A room you claim to have occupied alone. And the lighter, this silver lighter with its floral pattern." He produced the object from his pocket, holding it aloft. "It was found in the drawing room, near a smudge of ash that matches the tobacco in your case. Do you still maintain you were alone?" Charles's face reddened. "I told you someone took that case. I don't smoke in the house, and I don't own a lighter like that." Poirot turned to Clara Fielding, whose pale face seemed to shrink under his gaze. "Mademoiselle Fielding, you admitted to being near the study at 11:45, hearing an argument earlier in the day. Yet you did not mention this until pressed. And this cufflink," he produced the gold cufflink engraved with H.L., "found in the nursery, points to Dr. Langston. A convenient discovery, no? Or perhaps a deliberate misdirection?" Clara's hands twisted her handkerchief, her voice trembling. "I only found it this morning, Mr. Poirot. I swear I didn't place it there." Dr. Langston's jaw tightened, his tired eyes flashing with indignation. "This is absurd. That cufflink could have been dropped days ago. I haven't been in the nursery since Thomas's last checkup." Poirot's gaze shifted to Sir Reginald, whose ruddy face was flushed with anger. "Sir Reginald, you were reading in your bedroom, yet you overheard no argument, no footsteps, despite your room's proximity to the study. A curious silence, is it not?" Sir Reginald slammed a fist on the table. "I've had enough of this, Poirot. I loved my wife. I'd have heard if anything was amiss." Poirot's voice remained calm, but his words cut like a blade. "And yet, Lady Evelyn wrote of a betrayal, of money siphoned from the estate. A secret she confronted 2 days before her death. Did she confront you, Sir Reginald? Or perhaps you, Doctor? Langston, who wrote letters in blue ink, the same ink found on a burnt fragment in the study's fireplace." Langston's face paled, but he said nothing. Poirot continued, turning to Mrs. Dutton and James. "And you, the loyal servants, claim to have been below stairs. Yet the manor's walls are not so thick as to muffle all sound. Did you truly hear nothing?" Mrs. Dutton's lips pursed, but she remained silent. James, however, shifted uneasily, his youthful face betraying a flicker of guilt. Poirot's eyes locked onto him. "Monsieur James, you are young, impressionable. Perhaps you saw something, heard something, that you fear to reveal?" James's hands clenched, and he blurted, I did hear something, sir." A thud, like something falling around midnight. I thought it was just the house settling, but it came from upstairs. The room erupted in gasps. Margaret's glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor. "James!" she cried. "Why didn't you say so?" James's face crumpled. "I was scared, miss. I didn't want to get involved. I thought it wasn't my place." Poirot's expression was unreadable, but his voice carried a quiet authority. "Merci, James. Your candour, though late, is valuable. A thud at midnight, near the time of Lady Evelyn's death. This is no coincidence." He paced slowly before the table, his hands clasped behind his back. "Let us consider the evidence. A locked study, a single fatal wound, a letter opener from the desk, a scratched desk, a burned fragment of blue ink, a cigarette lighter, a cufflink, a cigarette case, a footprint, a scrap of cloth. These are not random. They are the threads of a tapestry, woven by a mind that seeks to deceive. But I, Hercule Poirot, see the pattern." He stopped, his gaze sweeping the room. "Tonight I set a trap. I have spoken of clues, of contradictions, and I have watched your faces. The guilty among you grows nervous, for you know that I am close. You have hidden behind lies, but the truth, it is like a flame, It burns through the shadows." A heavy silence fell, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. Margaret's eyes were wide with fear. Charles's jaw was set, and Clara's hands trembled uncontrollably. Dr. Langston stared at the table, his fingers twitching, while Sir Reginald's face was a mask of barely contained rage. Mrs. Dutton and James exchanged uneasy glances. Poirot's voice softened, but its intensity remained. "Tomorrow I shall gather you again, and I shall reveal the truth. But tonight, reflect on your secrets. The killer knows who they are, and they know that Hercule Poirot is watching." As the household dispersed, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous hall, Hastings leaned close to Poirot. "Good Lord, Poirot, that was masterful. You've got them rattled. But do you know who did it?" Poirot's smile was enigmatic. "The trap, mon ami, is not in knowing, but in making them believe I know. The guilty will act, they will falter, and in that moment the truth will emerge." Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, pattering against the windows like the ticking of a clock, counting down to the moment when Blackthorn Manor's darkest secret will be laid bare. Chapter 10. The Reveal. The morning of August 24th, 1925, broke over Blackthorn Manor with a sky heavy with clouds, the air charged with the promise of a storm. It was 10:03 a.m., and the drawing-room, with its high ceilings and sombre portraits, was filled with a palpable tension as the household gathered once more at Hercule Poirot's command. The candelabras from the previous night's dinner had been replaced with daylight streaming through the tall windows, but the atmosphere was no less oppressive. Captain Hastings stood by Poirot's side, his face a mixture of excitement and apprehension, while Inspector Grayson sat stiffly, his notebook open but his expression sceptical. The suspects, Sir Reginald Blackthorne, Margaret Blackthorne, Charles Wentworth, Dr. Hugh Langston, Miss Clara Fielding, Mrs. Dutton, and James the footman, sat in a tense semicircle, their eyes fixed on Poirot, who stood at the centre of the room, his small figure radiating authority. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his voice clear and deliberate, "last night I promised you the truth, and today I shall deliver it. The murder of Lady Evelyn Blackthorne was no act of chance, no work of a phantom intruder. It was a crime of precision, of motive, of betrayal, and the killer, they are in this room." A collective intake of breath rippled through the group. Margaret's hands clenched in her lap, and Charles Wentworth's jaw tightened. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back, pacing slowly, his green eyes gleaming with the certainty of a man who had unravelled the puzzle. "Let us reconstruct the night of the murder," he continued. "Lady Evelyn, she wrote in her diary of a meeting at 11 o'clock, a confrontation with someone she believed had betrayed her. She feared this betrayal would destroy us all. At some point between 11:30 p.m. and 12:15 a.m., she was stabbed through the heart with her own letter opener in a locked study with no signs of forced entry. The clues, the scratched desk, the burned fragment of paper, the cigarette lighter, the cufflink, the cigarette case, the footprint, the scrap of cloth, these were the threads of a tapestry, and I, Hercule Poirot, have woven them together." He paused, letting the silence build. First, the footprint and the cloth, found beneath the study window. They were too perfect, too convenient. A single footprint, no ladder marks, no other disturbance. No, this was a fabrication, placed to suggest an intruder. The cloth, blue wool, could belong to anyone. yet it was torn with precision, as if staged. Grayson bristled. That's speculation, Poirot. That footprint was real evidence. Poirot's smile was polite but firm. Evidence, Inspector, must be questioned, not accepted blindly. The footprint was made by a boot from this house, size 10, belonging to James, the footman. James gasped, his face paling. Me, sir! I never— Poirot raised a hand. Calm yourself, Monsieur James. You did not make the footprint, but your boots were used. They are kept in the servants' quarters, easily accessible. Someone borrowed them, pressed them into the earth, and returned them, hoping to divert suspicion. He turned to the cigarette lighter, producing it from his pocket. This lighter, with its floral pattern, was found in the drawing-room, near a smudge of ash that matched the tobacco in Monsieur Wentworth's cigarette case. Yet Monsieur Wentworth denies smoking in the house. Curious, no? And the lipstick on the cigarette, whose was it? Charles shifted uncomfortably, but Poirot's gaze moved to Clara Fielding. Mademoiselle Fielding, you have been most nervous. You admitted to being near the study at 11:45, hearing an argument earlier. You also found a cufflink, engraved with HL, in the nursery. But let us consider. The nursery is swept daily, yet this cufflink appeared only after the murder. It was placed there, was it not, to implicate Dr. Langston? Clara's hands trembled, her eyes wide. I only found it, Mr. Poirot, I swear. Poirot's voice softened, but his eyes were unrelenting. I believe you, mademoiselle. You found it because it was meant to be found. But you also lied about the nursery. You were not there all evening. You were near the study, and you heard more than you admitted. He turned to Doctor Langston, whose tired eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. Doctor, your cufflink, your blue ink. The burned fragment in the fireplace was written in blue, unlike Lady Evelyn's preferred black. You claimed to be in your cottage, writing letters, but you were in the manor, were you not? You argued with Lady Evelyn that day about money. Langston's face flushed. I never argued with her. I was her physician, nothing more. Poirot's moustache twitched. And yet, the diary tells us of a betrayal, of money siphoned from the estate. Lady Evelyn confronted someone. Let us turn to the scratch on the desk. A shallow mark, not from a struggle, but from a deliberate act. The letter opener was taken from the desk, used to kill, and left beside the body. But why the scratch? It was a distraction, meant to suggest a struggle that never occurred. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. The truth, it lies in the contradictions. The diary's missing page, the burnt paper, the lighter, the cufflink, all point to a plan, a careful orchestration. But one detail betrayed the killer. The time. Lady Evelyn's meeting was at 11, yet the murder occurred after 11:30. Why the delay? Because the killer needed time to prepare, to stage the scene. Poirot's voice grew quieter, more intense. The killer is Dr. Hugh Langston. A cry erupted from Margaret, and Langston leapt to his feet, his face ashen. This is preposterous! I was in my cottage! You have no proof! Poirot's eyes gleamed. Oh, but I do, Doctor. The blue ink on the burned fragment. It was from a letter you wrote, a letter Lady Evelyn found, detailing your theft from the estate to cover your gambling debts. You argued with her that day, as Mademoiselle Fielding overheard. You arranged to meet her at 11, but you arrived late, after burning the letter in the study's fireplace. You used James's boot to create the footprint, tore a scrap of your own coat, and planted the cufflink in the nursery to shift suspicion. The cigarette lighter, it was yours, left carelessly in the drawing room after you smoked to calm your nerves. Langston's hands shook, his voice rising. You can't prove any of this. It's all conjecture. Poirot produced the charred fragment from his pocket. This fragment, it bears your handwriting, Doctor, and the lighter, its floral pattern matches one you were seen with by Mrs. Dutton weeks ago. You killed Lady Evelyn because she knew your secret, and you feared exposure. The locked door, you used a duplicate key made earlier and returned it to the desk after the murder. Langston's composure crumbled, his shoulders slumping. I didn't mean to kill her, he whispered, his voice breaking. She threatened to ruin me, to tell everyone. I panicked. I only meant to scare her, but the letter opener, it happened so fast. Margaret sobbed, and Sir Reginald's face was a mask of rage. Grayson, stunned, moved to restrain Langston, who offered no resistance. Poirot's voice was calm but resolute. The truth, it always emerges. You wove a web of lies, Doctor, but the little grey cells of Hercule Poirot, they see through the shadows. As Langston was led away, the room fell silent, the weight of the revelation settling over Blackthorn Manor like the storm clouds outside, ready to break. Chapter 11. The Reflection. The drawing-room of Blackthorn Manor was quiet now, save for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Its steady rhythm seemed to echo the methodical workings of Miss Jane Marple's mind, as she sat in a high-backed armchair, her knitting needles clicking softly, her eyes sharp and thoughtful. The events of the previous evening, the dramatic gathering in which Miss Marple had unravelled the tangled threads of deception, still hung in the air like the faint scent of lavender from Lady Beatrice's perfume. The guests had dispersed, some in shock, others in quiet relief, but all profoundly altered by the truth that had been laid bare. Captain Hastings, seated across from her, fidgeted slightly, his brow furrowed. He had been Miss Marple's faithful companion throughout the investigation, yet even he, accustomed as he was to her brilliance, found himself reeling from the revelation of the murderer's identity. The fire in the hearth cast flickering shadows across his face as he leaned forward, his voice low but insistent. "Miss Marple," he began, "I confess I'm still trying to piece it all together." "How did you know? I mean, really know? There were so many threads, so many lies. I thought poor Mrs. Langley was the victim of her own foolishness, but you saw something else entirely." Miss Marple's needles paused for a moment, her hands resting lightly in her lap. She regarded Hastings with a gentle smile, though her eyes held that familiar glint of steel. "My dear Hastings," she said, her voice soft yet precise, "it is not enough to see. One must observe. The truth is always there, hidden in the little details, the things people say without meaning to, the things they do and they think no one is watching. The human heart, you see, is a curious thing. It betrays itself in the smallest of ways." Hastings leaned back, exhaling slowly. "But the cigarette case," he said, "that was the key, wasn't it? I thought it was just a trinket, a careless mistake by young Philip. And yet you built the entire case around it." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, as if conceding the point, though her expression suggested she was far from finished. "The cigarette case was indeed significant, Hastings, but not for the reasons you might think. It was not merely that it was found in the wrong place. Tucked beneath the cushion of the library sofa, where Mrs. Langley was found. It was what it represented. A man like Philip Grayson, so proud, so meticulous about his appearance, would never misplace something so personal. And yet there it was, in a room he claimed not to have entered that night. That, my dear friend, was the first crack in his carefully constructed alibi. She resumed her knitting, the needles moving with a rhythm that seemed to mirror her thoughts. You see, Hastings, people lie. They lie to protect themselves, to protect others, or sometimes simply because they cannot face the truth. But lies, like poorly knitted stitches, always unravel. Philip's lie was not in what he said, but in what he did not say. His silence about the cigarette case was louder than any confession. Hastings rubbed his temples, a faint smile tugging at his lips. You make it sound so simple, Miss Marple. But there was so much else. The broken clock, the spilled tea, Lady Beatrice's hysterics, Dr. Hargrove's insistence that he was in the garden. How did you sort through it all? Miss Marple's smile deepened, though her eyes remained fixed on her knitting. The clock, the tea, the hysterics, they were all part of the tapestry, Hastings. Each thread had its place, but only when viewed together did they form a picture. The broken clock, for instance, was not broken by accident. It was deliberately stopped at 9:17 to suggest the time of Mrs. Langley's death. But the tea, spilled so carelessly on the rug, told a different story. Tea does not spill itself, Hastings. It requires a hand, a moment of distraction, or panic. And Lady Beatrice's hysterics, while convincing, were her performance. A woman who faints so dramatically in front of others is rarely as fragile as she seems. Hastings stared at her, his admiration tinged with exasperation. But Philip, how did you know it was him? He seemed so ordinary, a bit vain perhaps, but not a murderer. Ordinary, Miss Marple repeated, her tone carrying a hint of reproach. There is no such thing as an ordinary person, Hastings. Every soul carries its own burdens, its own secrets. Philip Grayson was a man consumed by ambition, but also by fear. Fear of losing what he had worked so hard to gain. Mrs. Langley, you see, knew something about him, something he could not allow to be revealed. She was not the saintly widow everyone believed her to be. She was a woman who collected secrets, and she wielded them like a weapon. Hastings nodded slowly, piecing it together. The letters, he said, the ones you found in her room, hidden in the false bottom of her jewellery box. Precisely, Miss Marple said, her needles clicking softly. Mrs. Langley had a habit of keeping correspondence, letters that revealed indiscretions, debts, betrayals. One such letter was from Philip's past, a letter that could have ruined him. He thought he had destroyed it, but he was mistaken. Mrs. Langley had kept a copy, and she made the fatal error of letting him know. The fire crackled, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Hastings leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. So he poisoned her tea, then staged the scene to look like an accident. But why the cigarette case? Why leave it there? Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction. He did not leave it, Hastings. He dropped it. In his haste to leave the library after poisoning the tea, he was careless. The cigarette case fell from his pocket, and he did not notice. It was a small mistake, but a fatal one. The human mind, you see, is not as clever as it believes itself to be. It betrays itself in the smallest of ways. Hastings shook his head, marvelling. And the others, Lady Beatrice, Dr. Hargrove, even young Eleanor, they all had their secrets, didn't they? Indeed, Miss Marple said, setting her knitting aside and folding her hands in her lap. Lady Beatrice was hiding her financial troubles, desperate to maintain her status. Dr. Hargrove was concealing his own indiscretions, fearing exposure. And Eleanor, poor, sweet Eleanor, was caught in a web of loyalty and love, torn between her duty to her aunt and her feelings for Philip. Each of them had a motive, a reason to wish Mrs. Langley gone. But only one had the means, the opportunity, and the nerve to act. The room fell silent, save for the ticking of the clock. Outside, the wind howled softly, rattling the windows of Blackthorn Manor. Hastings stared into the fire, his mind turning over the events of the past week. "You know, Miss Marple," he said at last, "I've seen you solve cases before, but this one, it feels different. There was so much darkness here, so much hidden beneath the surface." Miss Marple nodded, her expression softening. "Evil, Hastings, is not always loud or obvious. It hides in the quiet moments, in the polite smiles and the carefully chosen words. But it cannot hide forever. The truth, like a well-stitched seam, always holds." She rose from her chair, smoothing her skirt with a practised hand. "Come, Hastings, the train to London leaves in an hour, and I have no intention of missing it. There is a certain order to life, you know, and I like to keep to it." Hastings stood, offering her his arm with a smile. "You're remarkable, Miss Marple, truly remarkable." She took his arm, her step light but purposeful, as they made their way toward the door. "Nonsense, Hastings," she said, though her eyes twinkled with quiet pride. "I am merely a woman who pays attention, and that, my dear friend, is enough." As they stepped out into the cool evening air, the lights of Blackthorn Manor glowed softly behind them, a silent witness to the secrets it had held, and the truth that had set it free. Chapter 12. The Unseen Thread. The train to London rattled along the tracks, its steady rhythm a stark contrast to the tumultuous events that had unfolded at Blackthorn Manor. Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her knitting resting lightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the rolling countryside beyond the glass. The fields, bathed in the soft golden light of late afternoon, seemed peaceful, almost serene, but Miss Marple's mind was far from idle. Her thoughts, sharp and precise as ever, were weaving together the final threads of the mystery that had consumed her for the past week. Captain Hastings, seated opposite her, was less composed. He shifted in his seat, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest as he glanced at her. "Miss Marple," he said, breaking the silence, "I've been thinking about what you said last night, about the truth always holding, like a well-stitched seam, but there's something that still bothers me. Why did Philip go to such lengths to hide his motive? If Mrs. Langley was blackmailing him, surely he could have found another way." Miss Marple's eyes flickered toward him, her expression calm but tinged with that familiar glint of insight. "My dear Hastings," she said, her voice soft yet deliberate, "a man like Philip Grayson does not act out of reason alone. Ambition, fear, pride, these are powerful forces, and they twist the mind in ways that logic cannot always predict. Mrs. Langley's blackmail was not merely a threat to his reputation, it was a threat to the very identity he had built for himself. To a man like Philip, that was unbearable." Hastings frowned, his brow creasing. But to kill her! Surely that was a riskier path than facing her demands. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a steady counterpoint to the train's rumble. Risky, perhaps, but calculated. Philip believed he could outwit everyone. Mrs. Langley, the police, even me. He was clever, Hastings, but not clever enough. No one can account for every detail, no matter how meticulous they are. And it is in those overlooked details that the truth reveals itself. She paused, her fingers stilling as she looked out at the passing scenery. Consider the spilled tea, for instance. It was such a small thing, yet it told me so much. Tea does not spill itself, Hastings. It requires a moment of carelessness or intent. Philip, in his haste to leave the library after poisoning Mrs. Langley's cup, knocked it over. He thought to clean it up, to make it look like an accident, but he missed the stain on the rug. That stain, so small, so seemingly insignificant, was a thread that led me straight to him. Hastings leaned forward, his eyes bright with curiosity. And the broken clock? You said it was deliberately stopped at 9:17. Was that Philip's doing as well? Indeed, Miss Marple said, her voice carrying a note of quiet satisfaction. The clock was a clever touch, but a flawed one. Philip stopped it to establish a false timeline, to make it seem as though Mrs. Langley died earlier than she did. But he did not account for the fact that the clock's mechanism was slightly faulty, a detail I noticed when I examined it. The hands, you see, were not quite aligned. A clock stopped at 9:17 would have shown a precise alignment, but this one was off by a fraction. That told me it was tampered with, and only someone with access to the library could have done it. Hastings shook his head, a wry smile tugging at his lips. You notice everything, don't you, Miss Marple? I swear, nothing escapes those eyes of yours. Miss Marple's smile was modest, almost self-deprecating, but her eyes gleamed with quiet pride. It is not a matter of seeing everything, Hastings, but of understanding what you see. People are predictable in their unpredictability. They act according to their natures, and those natures leave traces, small, subtle traces that tell a story of their own. The train lurched slightly as it rounded a bend, and Hastings glanced out the window, his thoughts still tangled in the web of the case. What about Eleanor? He asked after a moment. She was so devoted to her aunt. Did she suspect anything, or was she truly in the dark? Miss Marple's expression softened, a flicker of sympathy crossing her face. Poor Eleanor, she said quietly. She was a young woman caught in a storm she could not fully comprehend. She loved her aunt, yes, but she also loved Philip. That love blinded her to his faults, as love so often does. I believe she suspected something was amiss, but she could not bring herself to face it. Her tears, her hesitation when I questioned her about Philip's movements that night. They were not the actions of a guilty woman, but of one torn between loyalty and doubt. Hastings nodded slowly, his gaze distant. And Lady Beatrice? Her hysterics seemed so real. I was convinced she was hiding something. Oh, she was, Miss Marple said, her tone sharpening slightly. Lady Beatrice is a woman who lives for appearances, and appearances require secrets. She was hiding her financial ruin, you see. Mrs. Langley knew of it, and Lady Beatrice feared exposure. But her fear made her cautious, not murderous. Her hysterics were a performance, yes, but they were also a release of genuine fear, not of guilt, but of shame. The train's whistle sounded. a shrill cry that cut through the quiet of the carriage. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, her movements precise and deliberate. You see, Hastings, every person in that house had a secret, a motive, a reason to wish Mrs. Langley gone. But motives alone do not make a murderer. It takes a particular kind of resolve, a coldness of heart to act on such desires. Philip had that resolve. He saw an opportunity and he took it. Hastings leaned back, exhaling heavily. It's a grim business, isn't it? All this deceit, all this scheming, just to protect a reputation or hide a past. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice remained steady. It is grim, yes, but it is also human. People are complex, Hastings. They love, they hate, they fear, they dream. And sometimes in their desperation to hold on to what they value, they lose sight of what is right. That is why we must always seek the truth, no matter how painful it may be. The train began to slow as it approached the station, the platform coming into view through the window. Miss Marple gathered her knitting and tucked it into her bag, her movements as neat and orderly as her thoughts. "Come, Hastings," she said, rising from her seat. "London awaits, and I dare say we have earned a rest." Hastings stood, offering her his arm with a smile. "You're right, Miss Marple, but I have a feeling you'll be back at it soon enough, unravelling another mystery with those little grey cells of yours." Miss Marple's laugh was soft, almost musical. "Perhaps, Hastings, but for now, let us enjoy the journey. There is a certain beauty in order, don't you think, even in the midst of chaos?" As they stepped onto the platform, the bustle of London surrounding them, Miss Marple's words lingered in the air, a reminder of the unseen threads that connected every human heart, and the quiet, relentless logic that could unravel them all. Chapter 13. The Shadow of Truth. The London air was crisp, tinged with the faint smokiness of autumn, as Miss Jane Marple and Captain Hastings stepped out of the train station and into the bustling heart of the city. The clatter of hooves and the hum of voices surrounded them, but Miss Marple's demeanour remained as serene as ever, her eyes scanning the crowd with the same quiet intensity she had applied to the secrets of Blackthorn Manor. Hastings, however, was still caught in the web of the case, his mind turning over the intricacies of Philip Grayson's crime and Miss Marple's uncanny ability to unravel it. They settled into a small, cosy tea-room near the station, the kind of place Miss Marple favoured for its understated elegance and the opportunity it afforded for observation. The table was set with a pristine white cloth, a pot of steaming Darjeeling, and a plate of scones that Hastings eyed with mild distraction. As the waitress retreated, he leaned forward, his voice low but eager. "Miss Marple," he said, stirring his tea absently, "I've been thinking about the letters you found in Mrs. Langley's jewellery box. You said they were the key to Philip's motive, but there's something I don't understand. How did you know to look there? It's not as if anyone pointed you to it." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her movements delicate and precise, before setting the cup down with a soft clink. "My dear Hastings," she said, her voice carrying that familiar blend of warmth and authority, "it is a simple matter of understanding human nature. Mrs. Langley was a woman who thrived on control, on knowing more than others. Such a person does not keep their secrets in plain sight. A jewellery box, particularly one with a false bottom, is a natural choice for someone like her, private, secure, and easily overlooked. I merely followed the logic of her character." Hastings shook his head, a wry smile playing on his lips. "You make it sound so straightforward. But those letters, they were damning, weren't they? Proof of Philip's past, of the scandal he was desperate to keep buried." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her eyes narrowing slightly as she recalled the details. "The letters revealed a transaction, a bribe, to be precise, that Philip had made years ago to secure his position at the bank. Mrs. Langley, with her knack for uncovering secrets, had obtained copies of those letters. She used them to exert pressure on Philip, threatening to expose him unless he complied with her demands. It was a dangerous game, and one she did not survive." Hastings frowned, his fingers tapping the edge of the table. But why didn't he just destroy the letters? If he was willing to kill her, surely he could have searched her room. Miss Marple's smile was faint, tinged with a touch of sadness. That, Hastings, is where Philip's arrogance betrayed him. He believed he had destroyed the originals, you see. He did not know that Mrs. Langley, ever cautious, had kept copies hidden away. It was a small oversight, but a fatal one. The letters were his undoing, not because they were found, but because they confirmed what I had already begun to suspect, that Philip's polished exterior hid a man capable of desperate acts. The tea-room was warm, the soft murmur of conversation around them, a soothing contrast to the grim topic. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where a young couple passed by, arm in arm, their laughter carrying faintly through the glass. "You see, Hastings," she continued, "people like Philip are not so different from the rest of us. They want to be seen as good, as successful, as untouchable. But when that image is threatened, they will go to extraordinary lengths to protect it. Philip's mistake was in believing he could outwit fate itself." Hastings nodded slowly, his mind piecing together the puzzle. "And the other clues, the cigarette case, the spilled tea, the stopped clock, they all pointed to him, didn't they? But only because you knew how to read them." "Precisely," Miss Marple said, her voice steady but soft. Each clue was a thread in the tapestry of the crime. The cigarette case, dropped in haste, told me Philip had been in the library when he claimed otherwise. The spilled tea suggested a moment of panic, a disruption in his carefully laid plan, and the stopped clock, well, that was his attempt to control time itself, to create a false narrative. But time, Hastings, is not so easily manipulated. It leaves its marks just as people do. A silence fell between them, broken only by the clink of porcelain as Miss Marple poured herself another cup of tea. Hastings leaned back, his expression a mix of admiration and lingering unease. "What about the others?" he asked after a moment. "Eleanor, Lady Beatrice, Dr. Hargrove. They all seemed so guilty at times. Were they just distractions, or did they play a part in it?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with quiet amusement. "Oh, they played their parts, Hastings, but not in the way you might think. Each of them was a mirror, reflecting some aspect of the truth. Eleanor's love for Philip blinded her to his flaws, but it also made her hesitate, which gave me the time I needed to observe. Lady Beatrice's hysterics were a diversion, but they also revealed her fear of losing her status, a fear that paralleled Philip's own. And Dr. Hargrove, with his guarded demeanour and his late-night walks in the garden, was hiding his own indiscretions, but not a murder. They were all part of the pattern, Hastings, but only Philip wove the thread of death. The tea room grew quieter as the afternoon waned, the light outside softening into the golden hues of dusk. Hastings stirred his tea again, his thoughts still restless. It's a grim business, isn't it? All these secrets, all this deceit, just to protect a name or a fortune. Miss Marple's expression softened, her hands folding neatly in her lap. It is grim, yes, but it is also the way of the world. People are frail, Hastings. They cling to their illusions, their pride, their dreams. And sometimes in their desperation, they lose sight of what is right. That is why we must be vigilant, not just to catch the guilty, but to understand them. Only then can we hope to prevent such tragedies. She rose from her chair, her movements as graceful and deliberate as ever. Come, Hastings. The day is drawing to a close, and I have a mind to visit my favourite bookshop before we return to the hotel. There is a certain comfort in stories, don't you think? Even the darkest ones have a way of making sense of the world. Hastings stood, offering her his arm with a smile. You're right, Miss Marple, and I suspect you'd find a mystery in even the most innocent of tales. Her laugh was soft, almost musical, as they stepped out into the London evening. Perhaps, Hastings, but for now, let us enjoy the simplicity of a good book and a quiet evening. There will always be another mystery waiting. As they walked down the street, the city alive with the hum of life, Miss Marple's words lingered, a reminder of the shadows that lurked beneath even the brightest facades, and the quiet, relentless logic that could bring them to light. Chapter 14. The Final Stitch. The soft glow of lamplight bathed Miss Jane Marple's modest hotel room in London, casting gentle shadows across the neatly arranged furniture. The air was warm, scented faintly with the lavender sachet she always carried in her travelling case. Miss Marple sat at a small writing desk, her knitting set aside for the moment, her hands folded as she gazed thoughtfully at the single sheet of paper before her. A letter she had begun to write to her old friend, Chief Inspector Japp, summarizing the Blackthorn Manor case. The task was not strictly necessary, for Japp had already been informed of Philip Grayson's arrest, but Miss Marple believed in the importance of clarity, of tying up loose ends with the same care she applied to her knitting. Captain Hastings, seated in an armchair by the window, was less serene. He leafed through a newspaper, though his attention kept drifting back to Miss Marple. The events at Blackthorn Manor still weighed on him, and his restless energy was evident in the way he tapped his foot against the floor. At last, he set the paper down and turned to her, his voice tinged with curiosity and a hint of frustration. "Miss Marple," he said, "I've been going over it all in my mind. The cigarette case, the letters, the stopped clock, and I still can't help but wonder if there was something we missed. Something that might have pointed to Philip sooner. It all seems so clear now, but at the time I was utterly lost." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint, understanding smile as she dipped her pen into the inkwell. "My dear Hastings," she said, her voice as calm and measured as ever, "it is the nature of a mystery to seem impenetrable until the final piece falls into place. You were not lost, merely looking in the wrong direction. The clues were always there, but they required a certain perspective to see them clearly." Hastings leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Perspective," he echoed, a touch of wry humour in his tone. "That's a polite way of saying I missed the obvious. But tell me, How did you know to focus on Philip? There were so many others, Lady Beatrice with her debts, Dr. Hargrove with his secretive walks, even Eleanor with her conflicted loyalties. They all seemed plausible suspects. Miss Marple set her pen down and turned to face him, her eyes sharp yet kind. It is not enough to suspect Hastings. Suspicion is a starting point, but it must be tempered with observation and reason. Philip stood out, not because he was the most obvious, but because he was the least consistent. His alibi was too perfect, his demeanour too polished. A man who is truly innocent does not need to rehearse his innocence. She paused, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the desk. Considered the cigarette case again. It was not merely that it was found in the library, but that Philip never mentioned it. A man who loses something so personal would notice its absence, would remark upon it, even if only to deflect suspicion. But Philip said nothing. That silence was a clue in itself, a thread that, when pulled, unravelled his entire facade. Hastings nodded slowly, his brow furrowing as he pieced it together. And the letters, those were the motive, weren't they? But how did you know Mrs. Langley was blackmailing him? She seemed so harmless, at least on the surface. Miss Marple's smile was tinged with sadness. Harmlessness, Hastings, is often a mask. Mrs. Langley was a woman who collected secrets the way others collect fine china. She had a way of listening, of watching, that made people confide in her, without realizing the danger. The letters in her jewelry box were not mere keepsakes. They were her leverage, her power. Philip's letter, in particular, was a weapon she wielded carelessly. She underestimated his desperation, and it cost her her life. The room was quiet for a moment, save for the distant hum of London's evening traffic. Hastings leaned back, exhaling heavily. It's chilling, isn't it? To think that someone could be so calculating, so cold, as to poison a woman over a few pieces of paper. Chilling, yes, Miss Marple agreed, her voice soft but firm. But not surprising. The human heart is a complex thing, Hastings. It is capable of great kindness and great cruelty, often in equal measure. Philip's crime was not born of sudden impulse, but of a slow, simmering fear. A fear that grew until it consumed him. He saw no other way to protect his future, and so he chose the path of destruction. Hastings glanced at the letter on the desk. His curiosity piqued. What are you writing to Jap? Surely he has all the details by now. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with a hint of amusement. Oh, he does. But Chief Inspector Jap is a man who appreciates a clear narrative. I am merely providing him with the order of events, the logic that led to Philip's unmasking. It is not enough to catch a criminal, Hastings. One must understand why they acted as they did. That understanding is what prevents future tragedies. She picked up her pen again, her hand steady as she resumed her writing. Besides, she added, almost as an afterthought, there is a certain satisfaction in setting things down in black and white. It is like finishing a piece of knitting. Every stitch in its place, every thread accounted for. Hastings chuckled, shaking his head. You're incorrigible, Miss Marple. I suppose you'll have this case tied up as neatly as one of your scarves. Order, Hastings, she said, her tone light but resolute. Order is the key to everything. Without it, we are lost in a sea of chaos. And I, for one, prefer to keep my feet firmly on solid ground. The clock on the mantel chimed softly, marking the hour. Miss Marple glanced at it, then set her pen down and folded the letter with care. "Come," she said, rising from her chair. "It is nearly time for dinner, and I have a mind to enjoy a quiet meal before we retire. Tomorrow is a new day, and who knows what mysteries it may bring." Hastings stood, offering her his arm with a fond smile. "No rest for the wicked, eh, Miss Marple? Or for the brilliant, it seems." Her laugh was soft and melodic as they left the room, the lamplight casting their shadows on the wall. A reminder that even in the brightest moments, the shadow of truth was never far behind. Chapter 15. The Tapestry Complete. The dining room of the modest London hotel was a study in understated elegance, its tables adorned with crisp linens and gleaming silverware. The air filled with the gentle clink of china and the murmur of polite conversation. Miss Jane Marple sat opposite Captain Hastings, her posture as impeccable as ever, her eyes bright with the quiet satisfaction of a case well solved. The meal before them, roast lamb with rosemary, accompanied by a glass of claret, was simple yet refined, much like Miss Marple herself. Outside, the city hummed with the energy of evening, but within the dining room a sense of calm prevailed, as if the world had paused to allow Miss Marple a moment of reflection. Hastings, however, was not quite ready to let the Blackthorn Manor case rest. He cut into his lamb, his brow furrowed with the lingering questions that had haunted him since their departure from the estate. "Miss Marple," he said, setting his fork down, "I've been thinking about Philip Grayson. He seemed so composed, so sure of himself. How does a man like that fall so far? To commit murder, I mean. It's almost unthinkable." Miss Marple sipped her claret, her expression thoughtful, her gaze drifting momentarily to the flickering candle on the table. "My dear Hastings," she said, her voice soft yet precise, "it is not so unthinkable when you understand the nature of ambition. Philip Grayson was a man who built his life on the foundation of appearances, wealth, status, respectability. But such foundations are fragile, and when they are threatened, a man may do desperate things to shore them up. Mrs. Langley's knowledge of his past was a crack in that foundation, and he believed murder was the only way to seal it." Hastings shook his head, a mix of admiration and exasperation in his eyes. "But you saw through it all, every lie, every misdirection. The cigarette case, the spilled tea, the stopped clock, the letters, it's as if you were weaving a tapestry of your own, picking up every thread he left behind." Miss Marple's smile was modest, but her eyes gleamed with quiet pride. "A tapestry, yes, Hastings. That is a fitting metaphor. Every case is like a piece of knitting, each clue a stitch, each suspect a thread. If you pull the wrong thread, the whole thing unravels. But if you follow the pattern, if you pay attention to the tension and the rhythm, the picture becomes clear. Philip's mistake was in believing he could control the pattern. He could not." She paused, her fingers brushing lightly against the stem of her glass. The cigarette case, for instance, was not merely a clue to his presence in the library. It was a symbol of his carelessness, his overconfidence. A man who takes such pride in his appearance does not misplace something so personal unless he is distracted or desperate. The spilled tea told of his haste, the stopped clock of his attempt to manipulate time. And the letters, well, they were the heart of it all, the motive that drove him to act. Hastings leaned back, his expression softening as he considered her words. And the others. Eleanor, Lady Beatrice, Dr. Hargrove. They were all part of the pattern too, weren't they? Each with their own secrets, their own reasons to want Mrs. Langley gone. Indeed, Miss Marple said, her voice tinged with a hint of sadness. Each of them carried a burden, a secret they feared would be exposed. Eleanor's love for Philip blinded her to his true nature, but it also made her vulnerable, torn between loyalty and truth. Lady Beatrice's financial ruin was a source of shame she could scarcely bear, and Dr. Hargrove's indiscretions made him wary, guarded. They were all threads in the tapestry, but only Philip's thread was stained with blood. The dining room grew quieter as the other guests began to depart, leaving Miss Marple and Hastings in a pool of candlelight. Hastings sipped his claret, his thoughts still turning over the case. "What I find most remarkable," he said at last, "is how you brought it all together in that final gathering. The way you laid out the evidence, step by step, until Philip had no choice but to confess. It was masterful." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with a touch of mischief. "Masterful, perhaps, but not magical, Hastings. It was simply a matter of applying pressure in the right places. People, you see, cannot resist the urge to explain themselves when confronted with the truth. Philip's confession was not a surprise to me. It was inevitable. Once I had shown him that his lies could no longer hold, he had no choice but to unravel." Hastings chuckled, shaking his head. "You make it sound so simple, Miss Marple, but I've seen you do this time and again, and it never ceases to amaze me. You see things the rest of us miss, and you make sense of them in a way that seems almost impossible." "Not impossible," Miss Marple said gently, "merely a matter of observation and understanding. The world is full of patterns, Hastings, and the human heart is no different. It leaves its traces in the smallest of things. A word, a glance, a misplaced object. To solve a mystery, one must simply follow those traces to their source." She set her glass down, her movements as precise and deliberate as ever. "And now, Hastings, the tapestry is complete. The case is closed, the truth revealed. There is a certain satisfaction in that, don't you think? Like finishing a piece of knitting and seeing the whole design come together." Hastings smiled, raising his glass in a small toast. "To you, Miss Marple, and your little grey cells. May they never cease to amaze." Her laugh was soft, almost musical, as she raised her glass in return. "To order, Hastings, and to the truth that lies within it. May we always find it, no matter how deeply it is hidden." As they finished their meal and stepped out into the cool London night, the city stretched before them, alive with possibility. The mystery of Blackthorn Manor was behind them, its secrets laid bare, its shadows dispelled. But Miss Marple knew, as she always did, that other mysteries awaited, other threads to be woven, other tapestries to be completed. And with her sharp mind and quiet resolve, she would be ready to unravel them all.